Here's an update on a video that I posted 10 years ago. A decade ago, I bought a used 2,332cc long block from my wife's coworker's husband, who had removed it from a trike. He claimed it was in good running condition, and I trusted him. I built up the rest of the engine with parts that I had lying around, and I put it in my wife's 1971 Karmann Ghia. As you can see from this old video, I immediately had difficulty getting the engine to run smoothly. I later found out why. The car was nominally drivable, and we even drove it to a VW car show where it won a prize. But it still ran rough. I had the chickens take a look. They thought the carburetor was too small, so I upgraded the manifold and added a Weber IDF. The car gained some power, but I still couldn't dial in the timing. During a short road test one day, I heard a crack from inside the engine and immediately lost a lot of power.
All right, I'm going to do a little bit of a reenactment here. Pretend that this head is still on the car. When I brought it into the shop, I pulled the valve cover off and found that I had a broken-in spring on my number 3 intake valve. And that, I think, is what caused the loud crack sound that I heard. And of course, with the spring being broken, the valve was free to kind of hop around there, and it wasn't closing properly, thereby letting a bunch of fuel down into the cylinder on number 3 and was causing it to fail, misfire. So I thought perhaps I can salvage this by getting a new spring on here. And one way to do that, with the head still in the car on the engine, was to unscrew this number 3 spark plug, and I took this hose here that has the same thread as a spark plug does and screwed it into the spark plug hole. The other end of it has this fitting which allowed me to squirt compressed air in there, but I just kept it on steady in order to force that valve out. And even with everything tightened up, I wasn't getting as much force as I needed, and I was hearing a hissing sound coming out of here somewhere. So it required that I take the head completely off the car.
Since the intake valve was staying open when it shouldn't, extra fuel was dumping into the cylinder. The extra gas effectively washed the protective oil film off of the cylinder wall and piston, so they began wearing excessively. After a little wire brushing, I could see that both cylinder heads were cracked, so I decided to buy all new heads, cylinders, and pistons and do a complete top-end rebuild. While setting the deck height, it occurred to me that the stroker engine was better suited to our 1969 double cab than to the Karmann Ghia, which I am now converting to electric. This decision also meant I could install the 2 Weber 44s that I had originally bought along with the long block. I rebuilt both carbs, which required a new pair of Panchito intake manifolds to fit the new heads. The front engine tin needed alteration to work with the new doghouse. I made a breather box out of an old lawnmower fuel tank and upgraded the distributor, alternator, and oil pump with more parts from CB Performance. Unfortunately, after all this work, the engine still ran rough. The loud clacking sound you just heard was traced to a loose crank gear. The gear was shifting back and forth a few degrees on the crankshaft, thereby causing the timing to jump around. This is the root cause of the problem I had 10 years ago. The engine had to be removed and rebuilt. Here's an up-close look at that loose gear. You can see where the gear wore down the crankshaft. The gear also bashed against the woodruff key and deformed it. I bought a new stroker crank, gears, and bearings. This is how the gear should behave. At each stage of a build, I check the rotation of the crank. It should always turn easily and smoothly like this with no tight spots. Off camera, I chased the threads on all the studs to help ensure proper torquing. I thoroughly cleaned both halves of the engine case, then applied a thin, even layer of Gasca cinch to their mating surfaces. I gently tapped the engine case into position using the handle of a dead blow hammer. I bought a new hardware set that accommodated my oversized 10mm head studs. Here I'm following the torque sequence as outlined in the unofficial Volkswagen Bible. Although I am touching the head of the torque wrench, I'm not applying any pressure that might interfere with the measurement. For the sake of time, I'm not showing the entire torquing sequence, but it involves multiple passes over the same nuts using progressively tighter torque settings. For each pass, I follow a star pattern in order to evenly distribute the force across the affected area. The last time I ran this engine, it leaked some oil, so I installed a new flywheel seal and a new empty sand seal. I reassembled the rest of the engine and reinstalled it in the truck, eager to hear how it would sound. It definitely ran better, but the engine was slinging oil all over the engine compartment. My custom machined pulley was not working with the empty sand seal. I bought a new pulley set and seal from CB Performance, which fixed the leak. Besides a little popping and misfiring, the valve train was making more ticking noises than I liked. My rocker arms have ball foot swivels that require more clearance than stock valve adjustment screws. I called Pat Downs at CB Performance to get advice on my valve geometry. Then I bought a variety of rocker arm shims, a set of aluminum pushrod blanks, and an adjustable pushrod tool. I used a tubing cutter to make my custom pushrods. I positioned the cutting blade based on my desired pushrod length. Then I carefully rotated the tool while gradually tightening down the blade. With the pushrods cut to length and deburred, it was time to install their end caps. I did this using a couple of old lifters, one to hold the factory finished end and one to protect the loose end cap as I pounded it into place. After reassembling the rocker arm shafts and properly aligning the valves, I turned my attention to the carburetor adjustments. I installed a set of 4 new idle air mixture screws and adjusted them by ear. Thanks for watching.